Thank you. I'm going to speak this afternoon about what it is we can do going forward. And to talk about that, I'm going to talk about where we are now and how I see the world and some of the things that have been emerging within it, and express my concern about that. And about 3-4 years ago in Halifax at one of the conferences of the Canadian Centre for Progressive Christianity, I spoke on the perfect storm, and that speech itself is in the Time or Too Late book. But I talked about the perfect storm, and many of you may know a perfect storm is when more than two different systems run into one another, usually at least three, and create a far different system than any of the others independently would have done. The term was coined after a storm in the northeast of the United States, which brought together three storms and created a catastrophic weather event there back 15 years ago or so, maybe a bit longer ago than that. And so the term perfect storm has been related to when events come together to create something that is far more catastrophic than any one of them may have created. The term has been lamented because it is used far too much, but I think it has particular importance for what it is we're talking about and what it is we gather about today. And one of the reasons that I think that's true is that not only do I think that there are three situations in the world that are coming together to create a perfect storm, each of those has a perfect storm happening within them right now. So the catastrophic possibilities are enormous. And so I raised this in 2013. I raise it again today. I speak about it regularly because I think that we do have some complicity in it and we have much that we could do. So I'm going to speak the three different things that are setting out this perfect storm are issues related to the planet, issues related to society, and issues related to religion. And if any one of those was dealt with and figured out and was off the radar, then what would happen with the other two would significantly dissipate the concern. But right now, because they are all heightened, we have concerns about all of them, that concern is not mitigated, and we continue to head toward what could be a disastrous situation. So for the planet, I'll speak about three things that are affecting the planet, which create this perfect storm in terms of the planet and its future. They are population, resource depletion, and resource destruction. Population, as you know, continues to grow at an exponential rate. We hit 1 billion people at the beginning of the 1900s. We're now at over 7.5 billion. Some estimates say that we'll be at 9 or 11 million by the middle of the century. And the question is, how do we support that kind of population in our countries, on the planet? Many of us have seen exodus from rural populations into urban settings where people are even more removed from the resources that they need to survive. And so if systems break down in those urban resources, it's very difficult for them to reach out and get what it is that they need. In 2005, the power grid on the entire eastern seaboard of North America went down, and for 48 hours, many people didn't have any access to anything electronic. And at one point, that meant your lights. It now means your access to information, it means your banking, it means the gasoline for your car, it means absolutely everything. So I tried to get my church to develop an urban survival course to help us figure out what to do when our electronic systems go down and we can't function, but they didn't take me up on it. But it is a concern when higher number of peoples are living, many of them in high-rise apartments which have no elevator services and no air conditioning services, live in buildings with no circulatory air at all. The challenges that can arise in a catastrophic situation are huge. So we watched that happen as Harvey hit Florida, and many of the housing places that had no air circulation found themselves in desperate situations, and people were dying because of those circumstances. So population and where that population is located is a very real challenge when it comes to planetary resources. The next one is resource depletion. We have used the world in ways that satisfy our needs. And over the course of our history, we have found ourselves moving from one place to another, or civilizations becoming extinct, disappearing, because they have either fed themselves out of any kind of arable land around the community, or they have destroyed the resources that were required for them to continue. And so there are theories around the fall of Rome that are related to food sustainability, and we look at food sustainability in many areas of the world, currently a crisis in Africa, and we wonder how we can feed this growing population. So resource depletion is very, very real. We also talk about peak oil. Many people say that we're past the moment of peak oil, that we're living off the resources that we can find in the world now, which are way less than they ever were, and that we will run out of that in the near future, and the price of oil will continue to rise. Ronald Wright, who wrote a book, The Brief History of Civilization, also wrote a romance novel in 1999 called A Scientific Romance. And in that, he imagines that Wells's time machine appeared in 1999, and that he got in it and went 500 years in the future. And what he comes across 500 years in the future, spoiler alert, is that social community has completely disintegrated to the point where it is back in that place that Albert Einstein said, I don't know what tools World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. And so this community that he finds 500 years into the future, which has no hope of ever discovering oil because we have used all the oil, and has lost its ability to read, so has no way of understanding the history of the world, that's what the future holds for us. And that's a very real concern. Resource destruction is another element. We continue to destroy resources in the world to feed our own needs. Many of us will know about the destruction of rainforests in order to create arable land on which to grow soy, which feeds our meat industry. Recognizing that by destroying those rainforests and destroying trees like that, we're destroying the lungs of the world, and so depleting our oxygen capacities, that our oceans are being destroyed because they're becoming carbon sinks, and as they absorb more carbon, coral reefs are bleached, and when coral reefs stop providing life and giving life, entire systems can fail. There have been scientific projections about how those systems will fail, many of them saying, you know, this will happen first, and then over time this will happen, and then time again this will happen. But the reality that they're seeing is that once things go, there's an entire system that collapses almost immediately. So we really, whatever those projections are, we're not really certain how it will play itself out. When a particular shelf of ice falls off an iceberg somewhere, that may be the turning point for the oceans and for life on the planet as we have known it. We simply don't know all of that information. But we continue to privilege our own lifestyle, our own tastes, our own desires, at the risk of setting off that motion, which we will not be able to stop. So that's the perfect storm in the planet. And now we'll go to the perfect storm in society and speak about three of the things that are changing how we have been in community ever before, that call us together in new ways and send us away from each other in new ways. And all of those mean that we no longer function in the way that we once did. The article that Julie mentioned today saying that the UK is this experiment of trying to live together without a common narrative, without a common story. Our society is breaking down into a multitude of stories that are not cohesive, that often can't even talk to each other, and we are figuring out how to do that. So the three things that I identify as creating a perfect storm in terms of society are global communications, leadership, and disintegrated community networks. Global communications have been like the most amazing thing. They have been a development that have allowed us to connect with people on the other side of the planet, to build relationships, for playing games and having conversations and becoming enlightened by what's happening elsewhere. Google was given permission to fly its internet balloons over Puerto Rico as a way of allowing communications to that very challenged island, which was destroyed in the recent hurricane. We have the ability to communicate in ways that we never have before. Jeremy Rifkin, in his book, The Empathic Civilization, talks about that growth of communications and how he argues that the networks of communications that are developing now have the capacity to draw us into an almost collective empathy, which will allow us to respond to what's going on in other areas of the world with a compassionate response to them, because we feel connected, we know them. When we were preparing for the conference in Edmonton that was starting on September 1st, I decided 2 weeks before that I would put together the book, It's Time or Too Late. And Scott had decided at the beginning of August that he would put together the book Songs for Anyone, not realizing that it takes him almost a week to write one of those songs out, and he had 24 songs to write out. So we were pressed for time. So what did we do? We went online and we found people in other areas of the world that could help us. So a gentleman in Kenya I took pictures of the music Scott had written, sent it to the guy in Kenya. He put it on the music notation software, sent it back to us. We proofed it. I noticed as we were singing today, when I was looking over Chris's shoulder, I found 2 places where the lyrics are wrong. We never proofed the lyrics. We proofed the music. We never proofed the lyrics. So I'll do those corrections for you if you want. But we had someone in Kenya do that. I pulled all my speeches and articles together. I sent them off to a guy in Finland. He did the copy editing for me and sent it back to me within 48 hours. So we can make connections. We can take advantage of that. But one of the other things that communication systems are doing for us, global communications like Google and Facebook and Twitter, is that they are exacerbating our differences. The algorithms that Google uses when we go do a search for something are based on our shopping habits, the previous search terms that we've had, what groups we like on Facebook, what our last tweet was about, who we tweeted it to, the different organizations to which we belong, what newsletters we've signed up for. All of that information is fed into Google's algorithm. So when I Google, what's something I would Google resource depletion or climate change, I will get fed, what do you get? A list of 100,000 different titles? And the top 5 or 6, which is all I ever look at, are exactly tuned to who I am and what it is I want to read. It's very rare that I would get in front of me an article that would really tick me off. Yet when I was in theological college, I was taught that every day you should read something that enhances and supports your perspective, and you should read something that you want to throw across the room. I threw almost all of my theology texts across the room. They told me to. But we don't run into that stuff anymore. And we're losing our capacity to have those conversations with people who disagree with us. So my feed about global warming will give me the latest scientific studies. And someone else's feed on global warming, if they plug in exactly the same search term, they may get all that stuff that shows that scientists are hyping it up and it's a conspiracy, a Chinese conspiracy, and all of that kind of stuff. And so they get reinforced in their perspective, and I get reinforced in my perspective, and we don't talk to one another. And having those difficult conversations is becoming more and more difficult because we are being affirmed in our own perspectives over and over and over again. And I believe that that's a very serious issue that's facing society now and will continue to face it in the future. I have concerns about leadership. And those concerns are because I think that we have been we have not been focusing on developing leaders. We have been focusing on developing lifestyle choices. That the leaders in our institutions often fail on some of the things that historically leadership has done. And leadership has generally set before us guidelines around what it is we want to achieve and how to achieve it. It has walked alongside us, given us plans, encouraged us, allowed us to become leaders ourselves so that we could bring to bear those things, those ideals that we wanted to have lived out in our institutions, in our corporations, in our families, in our social circles. I don't think that leadership is something that is revered in the way that it has been in the past, for good or for ill, but certainly for the good. And so I believe that rather than take up a leadership role, many people are opting out of leadership and into comfortable lifestyle choices that don't ask much of them. And I think that that's a challenge going forward, because we need people who are willing to pour their lives moment by moment into what it is that this world needs to be. And without leaders, we're not going to get there. So I think that that's a very serious issue, is the lack of leadership. We look at people that we admire as role models, or that are identified by culture as role models. And very often, if you scratch the surface, there's not much there that we really would admire. There are caricatures of leadership that are not being fulfilled in ways that are helpful to our social circles. The next one is the disintegration of community networks. And we live in the 21st century, and we are familiar with the way our world works, and we're familiar with our social circles, and we're familiar with our networks. But how many of you were born in the city? How many of you were born outside of a city? And how many of those people now live in a city? A lot of you. There's a movement away from rural life into cities that has a distinctive effect on society. Because when we were born and lived our lives in one setting, it could have been a city setting, but it was more likely a rural setting of some sort. When we had a broken relationship with someone, you couldn't afford to let it just bleed to death. You had to go to your neighbor and work it out. I mean, other than the Hatfields and McCoys, who, had a historic feud that went on forever and ever and has songs written about it, most of us couldn't afford to not speak to our neighbor in those settings. Or we couldn't afford to allow the breakdown in our families so that siblings don't speak to each other anymore. We had to have the support and the help of those people in those communities and those families around us. And now, more and more, it is becoming the norm for us to live in isolation from those people. A few years ago, there was an explosion in an apartment building not far from the church, and one of the members of the church lived in that apartment building, had lived there for 15 years. When the whatever it was exploded, they all had to move out. And she got to know people on the floor that she had lived next door to for 15 years and never said hello to. And they found these incredible friendships. But without that catastrophic event in that building, she never would have met them. She never would have got to know them, because we live in these isolated places. A woman that I was staying with in Nova Scotia when I was speaking there a couple of weeks ago has just returned from Toronto, and she was a member of West Hill United, she and her husband. They moved back to her family home in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. When she moved to Toronto and had her children, she had her children far away from her family. She had no supports when she initially had her children and took them home. There was no one that was going to come and help her figure out how to breastfeed, unless it was someone in some group that she could call, or what to do in the middle of the night when she really wanted to just drop the kid out the window, right? Like, how do you survive that when you're on your own, when you don't have those contacts? We never had children in isolation before, and many, many, many children are born into isolated situations now. So what happens with that breakdown of community, that breakdown of those relationships, is not just a breakdown of, and an increase in instability. It's a breakdown of accountability and a breakdown of responsibility and a breakdown of neighborly relations. And I think that that's a very real issue in our society. So those are the three things: the disintegrated community networks, the leadership crisis, and global communications that I think are affecting our societies in significant ways. And the third one is religion, and I'm going to talk about in terms of relevance, depletion, loss of community hub as a resource, and masturbation. And I'm going to say the masturbation one last, so you'll pay attention for the rest of them. So relevance depletion is significant in our liberal communities, in liberal church communities. We have in the past had the ear of our governments. We have had leaders who have been listened to by those who made crucial decisions. We could bring our perspective about relationship, about human rights, about social justice, about climate. I mean, the United Church had a general council, which is the highest level of the United Church, staff person on the environment back in the early 1980s, who participated in the Rio de Janeiro Climate Summit back in the early 1990s. We had the resources to support the exploration and the understanding of so many critical issues, and we could take our perspective to those in who had the decision-making capacity in our governments. We're now tolerated more than anything else. Rarely are we sought out for our perspective or guidance on these issues, not just because the time has passed, but because we no longer have the resources to staff those who are studying and exploring that and bringing a critical perspective forward. We're no longer able to collate the information that we need in order to be authorities in how to deal with these things with an ethical responsibility being placed upon the government as we share what it is that we know. So that's a very significant loss for us. A few years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, the United Church Observer, which is our national magazine, it is at arm's length from the United Church. Only a very small portion of its funding comes from the United Church, so it has editorial freedom. It does a survey every now and then, and the survey that it did a couple of years ago went out to the general public, and it asked questions about the United Church. Do you know who the United Church is? Do you know what the United Church does? When was the last time you engaged with the United Church? What was the last thing you read in the news about what the United Church is doing? It all came back with a big who? Who? They didn't know who the United Church was. They had no idea what the United Church did, what its interests were. They were interested in some of the topics that it said the United Church participated in, but they had no idea. So basically, when it came to asking Canadians who the United Church was, they had no idea and they were really uninterested. So while we were formed in 1925 in order to create the largest Protestant denomination in the country that could both win the country for Christ and be a voice for change and stability and liberal ideals and ethics in the country, no one even knows who we are or cares at this point in time. So our voice has been depleted to almost silence. We are irrelevant as far as the general person on the street is concerned. The loss of the community hub is another significant thing, and I'm not sure if you're experiencing this in the UK or not, but the United Church of Canada is closing a church a week. I think that's speeding up a little bit these days, but closing a congregation a week is a significant number of congregations gone over the course of a decade. I began in Scarborough, the area of Toronto that I serve, and when I started there were 24 congregations functioning in that area. In 2010, there were 14 of them, and in 2014, we were on the cusp of another couple of them closing. But the statistics between 2010 and 2014 showed an incredible loss in membership. Between 2010 and 2014, 12 of those 14 congregations lost 22.5% of their members. That's a quarter of their membership lost in those 4 years. Only 2 of them grew in that time. One of them was West Hill. We grew by 10% during that time. And the other was the congregation that everybody who was angry about what happened at West Hill went to. So we were happy to have bumped their numbers up for a little time. But those congregations that were still in existence, other than maybe 2 or 3 of them, were only in existence because other congregations had closed and taken their resources to them. So the life expectancy of those congregations is, again, very, very short. So what does this mean to communities? Churches used to be a hub of community activity. People came to the church for a variety of reasons, for community, for social engagement, for volunteer opportunities, for creative opportunities, and to engage in new ways. I often look at people in congregations, and it's generally an older population, and I say, you don't come to church because you like what's going on Sunday morning. You come to church because you fell in love with being together 40 years ago, and you're still in love with being together. Being together is one of the most important off-label benefits of religion, is bringing people into connection with one another. So our elderly people who are primarily the people in our congregations, they're not there for the sermon. They're there for the social connections that they made long ago. And if they move to a new community, they go looking for that because they know that's where they're going to get that incredible feeling of belonging, of being welcome, of being loved. So when we lose our churches, we lose a huge, not just a history in the community, but we lose an incredibly important resource. So now I get to masturbation. And this is one of the critical elements of religion that I think is adding to this perfect storm that we're experiencing within religion. And that is that we have stopped looking beyond ourselves for what it is that we need to do. And we have instead become increasingly involved in masturbatory undertakings. And I say that in relation to theology, I say that in relation to liturgy, and I say that in relation to spirituality. So what do I mean by that? I hope I don't have to define masturbation for you, but you will all know that masturbation is something that people do alone for the most part, and they do it to pleasure themselves. And it's not something that anybody ever really wants to watch, right? So when communities of faith get tied up in making themselves feel good by creating liturgies that are celebrated and enjoyed by the people who come there, but would be totally foreign and misunderstood by others who come into the space, that's a masturbatory liturgy. That's liturgical masturbation. So let's have an example of the Eucharist or communion. If someone comes in to a community that's having communion or the Eucharist that Sunday, and the language is all the language of 1st century or 3rd century or 10th century Christianity, is the person walking in the door going to get what you mean by it? Is that person going to feel included? Or are they going to think that you're doing some kind of rite that is like just seriously weird? If they aren't included by the words that you're using, if they aren't invited to be part of the table, if they don't feel connected by what it is you're offering, then what you're offering is only being offered for yourselves. And you need to recognize that because that's very, very important. In the same way, spirituality and the spiritual but not religious, often their spiritual pursuit is about feeling better about ourselves. All of that other perfect storm stuff that's going on in the world makes us pretty nervous. We feel out of sorts, we feel disconnected, we feel anxious, and so we go about looking for something that will make us feel better. And many spirituality workshops, sessions, groups, teachings, leaders are all about making you feel okay. They'll sell you anything to make you feel okay. And it's an incredible industry now. Spirituality is an industry in and of itself, because so many of us feel anxious and disconnected, and that spirituality will make us feel connected. But a spirituality that doesn't turn us toward the other is masturbation. It's about taking care of me and not connecting me with you. And I want my spirituality to connect me with all of life on this planet. So that's a very important aspect of religion that we have lost hold of and allowed to be commodified by a group outside of us. And then theological masturbation is what I am so generally confronted with when I engage in conversations with my denomination. I'm going to speak a little bit about the denomination in a moment. But many of my colleagues argue that when I talk about the God that I think needs to be eradicated from our language, that theistic, supernatural, interventionist, all-powerful, judgmental, condemning God, they're frustrated with me because they have spent decades refining interpretations and definitions of God that allow them to continue to use the word. And so that word comes to mean a force in the universe that interpenetrates the universe, exists within it and beyond it, and can be active in it in ways that we can't define, but that we may be able to witness. And when I use the word God, that's what I mean. Well, how on earth is anyone supposed to know that's what you mean? I wouldn't know that's what you meant if you used the word God. And if I use the word God, and I meant, the creating what is sacred, by which I mean something that's so essential to our humanity between you and I, and establishing the strength, the power of that, and living on the privilege and beauty and strength of that, if I used God to describe that, how is anybody supposed to know that's what I mean? So when our theologies are tied up in allowing us to hold on to a word, that's all about making us feel good. That's not about communication with people beyond our churches. It's not about communication with people who are not in our pews. It's about making us feel good about holding on to a word. And sometimes it's about making us feel superior, which is even worse. So that's theological masturbations. So if any one of these three disappeared, if religion got it together, and we started connecting people with one another with an integrity and a strength and a depth that galvanized our understanding of relationship, that committed us to each other in a rare and beautiful way, that became the norm and wasn't rare, but became something that we lived by, that was so deeply embedded in our heart and in our relationships that we modeled that for everyone we met within and outside of our religious communities, and that was no longer an issue, then we'd be left with just society and the planet, and maybe the loss of the communities that could address those things most profoundly wouldn't be a big deal. And if our social ailments were resolved to the point that, our connections were rarely broken, and when they were, we created new ones, like neural connections that look for somewhere to find home. If we were able to do that in our relationships, then maybe we could deal with religion, the loss of religion and the planet stuff without worrying about that social breakdown. And if our planetary woes, came to an end because science figured it all out and suddenly we could live on Mars or whatever the solution might be, and we were able to sustain our planet in ways that could sustain a population that we're going to end up with, then the other two things wouldn't matter. But as long as all three of those are conspiring within themselves and against one another, we are in peril. That's where we are. We are in peril. So what are the implications for that? And how can we, as people who are in a church, move to respond to some of that and become a force for something positive in the world? And here I'm going to talk a little bit about this moment in the United Church of Canada, which is the church in which I am a minister. And one of the responses that I think is problematic. In Canada, the growth of religious communities has always followed the lines of immigration. And so all our religious communities grew incredibly in the 1950s and 1960s as waves of UK and white European people flowed into the country. It was a time of incredible growth for us, and that's the time that I talk about when I say you fell in love with being together. That was in those fantastic communities that were created. In 2009, shortly after my book was written, I was concerned that clergy were contacting me and saying that they wanted to come out as not believing in God to their communities, that they didn't believe in God, and they were so pleased that I had written that I didn't either, and I'd written a book, and so they were going to tell their congregations that they didn't believe in God. And I had one woman write and tell me she was coming out to her congregation on Palm Sunday. Now, think for a minute. What follows Palm Sunday? Not the best week to decide that you're going to tell your congregation you don't believe in God. So I went to the national office because I wanted to talk to them about how we could put a bubble around these clergy who wanted to bring their communities up to speed with the theological education they had received from the United Church. How could we flow resources to them? How could we protect them from being fired the week after they spoke to their congregation about it? How could we make it work for them? And one of the national staff people looked at me and said, well, you know, Gretta, I don't even know that the United Church wants to go in a progressive direction. Now, everything I've told you about the United Church would make you scholars of the United Church, clearly, but at least you would maybe know that we've always moved in a progressive direction. So someone saying that the United Church didn't want to do that was totally crazy to me. So I made that clear, that I didn't know what they were talking about, and they said, well, you don't want a lily white pew, do you? And I said, I don't know what you mean by that either. And he said, well, if we're going to attract the immigrant population, we have to have a more conservative theology, which is horrific in a couple of ways. One, it meant that the staff of the General Council were willing to steer the theological direction of the church, with or without the knowledge of the wider church. And two, it meant that they were willing to steer the direction in terms of where they thought the market share lay. So they were going to steer it in a more conservative direction, despite 95 years to the contrary, in order to capture the immigrant population. And at that point in time, the religious immigration to Canada was Muslims, Roman Catholics, or evangelical Protestants. So clearly they're looking for the evangelical Protestants. So I like doing these graphs. Some of you will have seen me do graphs like this in the past rather than having PowerPoint. Here's the church attendance graph for Canada, right? This is the 1950s and 60s with all the influx of all those people. And here's, you know, the millennium numbers way down here. And the curve is pretty smooth, right? So the United Church says, ooh, blip here. See that little wrist action? See the wrist action? Little blip here. Evangelical Protestants. Yep, we can go for that little blip. Okay, well, what would happen if they turned that graph over? I can't even do it properly. It would look like this, right? These are the people who don't go to church down here. And these are the people who don't go to church up here. So over time, the market share isn't the people that are in church. The market share is the people who are out of church, who won't come in. And what denomination can lay claim to that is perfectly poised to speak to that more than the United Church of Canada. I think that we were ready. We'd been training our clergy to do this. You'd had a congregation who was doing it for 10 years at that time. We had a population that was growing on a daily basis that we could have addressed had we taken that decision. But we went for the wrist action down here instead of the other action. And I think that that's a huge issue. There's this fallacy of the big tent that the United Church has always seen itself as a big tent community. But there is a fallacy of the big tent that I think needs to be named, and that is that eventually you bring into the tent those people who are not as welcoming and not as tolerant as you are. And they often will draw the circle more closed than you would choose to do. And that's what's happened in the United Church in terms of my own leadership. So while I was trained within the denomination, raised in the denomination, ordained by the denomination, my beliefs are now considered inconsistent with the denomination because it has been moving in a more conservative direction over the past 10 years. So now we get to where we need to go from here. Because I think that these things are so important, because I think that social cohesion is crucial, because I think that healthy, grounded individuals are those who are going to create a world that has a sustainable future for our children's children's children. And I say that because I'm not thinking of, my own grandchildren. I'm thinking of children I will never know and generations I will never know. Because I think that people of goodwill may yet not understand or even have run into what the requirements are for their engagement in creating that world. And because I think religious community has had the corner on creating that awareness, on challenging people to see that goodwill sometimes isn't enough, but action and engagement and conviction is required. I think that the church, particularly the church, the liberal church, has much to offer the future. But I watch my own denomination die as it's trying to maintain its strength, as it reaches for that little wrist action of evangelical immigrants, not many of whom have ever found their way into a United Church despite the United Church's efforts. As I watch these communities diminish and decline and close their doors, I have very serious concerns about where that change in attitude, that invitation out of isolation and into relationship is going to come from. And so I think that those communities I spoke about earlier are very, very important. I also think that right now is the moment for the liberal church to create its legacy. Once a church is dead, it's not able to provide a legacy. It's not able to discern what its legacy is going to be. We have to figure that out before we die, right? I want to know what my legacy is going to be before I die. And there are those who say, well, that's an ego thing. Well, yeah, it is an ego thing, but it's my opportunity to provide something to the future. What is that going to be? How do I want to do that? Writing an ethical will is a way that many people now share what they've learned through the course of their lives with future generations, by just writing out what they've learned and what's important to them and how they chose to live and why they want to pass that on. And we do that as individuals. But can we do it as institutions? Can we do it as congregations? Can we provide a legacy to future generations to allow for these communities of change and transformation to be created, even if they are something that we would never have participated in ourselves? Do we have the courage and the insight to do that? Many of you will know James Fowler, who wrote on the stages of faith. I can never remember what 1 and 2 are, but stage 3 is where you have assimilated the belief system of the authorities in your life, and that becomes the way that you see the world, using those religious concepts as your own. That's stage 3. Stage 4 is when somebody starts pulling that apart and everything unravels, and you bring your own individual reflection to that and start critiquing it yourself. Often that's a pit. I think of that as a pit into which people fall, because it's a tragic undertaking and often a very catastrophic in an individual's life. And sometimes people never get out of that place, right? They just sit in that anger and fury for the rest of their lives because they've been lied to and they're furious about that. But others come to what, Marcus Borg called it post-critical naivety. There's critical naivety, or there's naivety and then critical thinking and then post-critical naivety. When you can look back on the tradition and pick up those things out of it that have meaning for you and that can take you forward. And in church, those people who reclaim those words and symbols and practices, that's where they're at. They're often at a stage 5. My problem with that is that stage 5 often looks and smells and wags its tail like stage 3, which means that if somebody comes in the door, they still think you have all of that in place rather than understanding that you see it very differently now. But the highest stage that Fowler identifies is stage 6, and that's a universalizing faith. That's when we get out of the way of ourselves, when we give all without any concern for ourselves or for our own longevity or for our own health. And you always hear of, there are generally 3 people identified with that universalizing faith stage. And that's Jesus and Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Dead, dead, dead. They were all assassinated, right? So does that hold out much hope for us? Can many of us walk that road? Can many of us live that life of self-giving? That, Jesus, if he taught us anything, he taught us that every breath was our life. And as we breathed our life out, we were called to breathe it into creating something beautiful. We were to pour our lives into something significant. Every breath pours our life out. So what do you want to pour your life out into? Do you want to pour it out into shopping? According to Alan Cooperman, that's what young people are doing. I don't think that's the case. But what are we pouring our life out for and into? What is that? I don't think any of us are likely to end up in a stage 6. I really don't. I mean, it asks the most incredible things of us that none of us can really achieve. But I think that our institution that has been church has the capacity to do that. I think our church can set those ideals in front of us, and fail though we will, it can hold them up and call us to them. I think that in an ideal world, in an ideal church, that's what it should do. Our church should be our stage 6, saying these are the things that you can live out. These are the things you can call yourself to. You're going to fail, you're going to fall, you're going to screw up, you're going to deny what it is that we're calling you to. You're going to do it over and over and over again. That's another part of the gospel message. But we can call you to this because we can put this on our wall and we can challenge you to live according to it. I don't think our churches do that right now. I think our churches are afraid. I think our churches are into survival. And so I don't know that they can do that work. But I know that collectively, if you sat together for another couple of hours after we finished talking, you could put together a set of ideals and values by which you would like to see the world live that would be extraordinary, that you could tape up beside your bathroom mirror and call yourself to live out. You could put together everything that universalizing faith would be, and you could invite one another to live according to it. I think that's the legacy that the liberal church has. And it's not going to come from the institution itself. It's going to come from the people in the institution, the people who recognize the gift that it has been in their lives. And even as our congregations close and our institutions falter, if we can have that as a legacy to give to future generations, for them to take and craft into whatever kind of organization they they require, they build, if they can take those values, own them, hone them according to the world that evolves and opens each day, some new way, a new interpretation, a new clashing of those values that calls us to reevaluate how we do things. If we can put that together and share that, maybe supporting some emerging communities as they do that themselves, then I think that will have been a worthy legacy. It grieves me that the institutions that have held those ideals before us, that have called us to be extraordinary gifts to the communities around us, it grieves me that those institutions are now failing to see what their greatest gift to the future might be. But I have hope that those who have sat within those pews and those chairs and who have worked on those boards and articulated and done the work person to person, I have hope that those will take that legacy and invite others to live it out into the future. Because beyond this place, beyond this moment, there are incredible storms to come. And we will need all the wisdom and all the fortitude and all the strength and all the vision that we can muster in order to get ourselves through those storms. So may we find ways to articulate the truths that we have come to know, and may we find ways to offer them to the future. Thank you.
I think you offered us a diagnosis of the nuns, and you hinted at the miscommunity of corporatism, and you offered us an apocalyptic diagnosis of the perfect storm. And in both cases, you called us to community, to make community. In faith we can, in love we will, or in community we will, I think was your phrase, and I agree with you entirely. I wonder whether you have omitted one key ingredient in the we and the community, and that's the we of the one-to-one, of the I-thou of love. And for those who retain their Christian traditions, the original Christian call seemed to be the I and my Lord, not our Lord, my Lord, Jesus, I and Jesus, the one-to-one. In my earliest life, which I don't remember, the one-to-one with my mother was the core. In my present life, which I do remember and enjoy, the key one-to-one is with my wife. And I think we can't build community until we can build one-to-one. Do you agree?
Absolutely. The I-thou is how I often speak about what my understanding of God was when I use that word. It's about lifting up that concept, which is from Martin Buber, and recognizing in the other that which is divine, or that which is sacred, or that which is so extraordinarily captured within that person that it's a gift to you and to them and to the world. And so when we develop a relationship with that, we're building that up by honoring it, and we're also building ourselves up by allowing ourselves to be transformed by that individual. So at West Hill, the things that we speak about are being in right relationship with self, others, and the planet. And the others is a very significant and very real part of that, those one-on-one relationships. And so on a Sunday, if you came to a Sunday service at West Hill, you'd hear me speaking about one of those things. It may be entirely about the planet. It may be entirely about justice issues related to other groups of people. It may be entirely about struggling through those one-on-one relationships and learning how to hold them sacred, meaning that they're so important that we can't compromise them, but we need to dignify and honor them. We're too prone in our world, I think, to take what is offered us by someone, to look for what we need in someone, and to leave the interaction having achieved whatever it was we needed out of the interaction. But if in those moments of interaction we can go beyond the transaction that we're negotiating to see the other as a thou, and to invite them to see us as that, I think we create something extraordinarily beautiful and very, very important going forward. So I appreciate your comments, and I think that's what we build upon, is our ability to do that and to make those relationships sacred, or to build God in the world, is how I used to talk about it.
I think I have no confidence in the future of the church. We're a remnant, a dying remnant. But if I was to make one decision in an attempt to sort of turn the tide, it would be to burn the hymn book. I would be persuaded to keep singing the faith, because there's enough in there that is both late 20th and 21st century. But the thing that bedevils me in having conversations with other people in the church is that they're not throwing biblical texts at me, they're throwing lines from some Victorian hymn as the substance of their faith.
When it's interesting to engage with the young people who are coming together in these Oasis communities. In Toronto, most of the people who are pulling that community together have no experience of church at all. They never went to church as children. Their parents didn't go to church, so they're trying to create something that looks and smells and wags its tail like church without it being church. And the ones who are creating the communities in the States most of them come from evangelical backgrounds. And one of the things that I think is so important about community is our singing together. It's historically, it's a primeval bonding reality that we engage in, which is so powerful in church. But it gives them hives. Like, it's a PTSD thing when people start singing in a group. These evangelical young people don't want it because it was used as a manipulative tool in the churches that they have been in, so they don't sing together. And I think that that's very sad. And there is, in the Toronto community, it's interesting because they don't have a church history, and they are starting to pull together a musical repertoire that they can sing. And I have had nothing to do with that. I've just watched it happen. And so they see that there's something that happens when people sing together in community that bonds them in a way that nothing else does so quickly. And I think we felt it this morning when we were singing Scott's music. I think you feel that sense of belonging when you can sing together like that.
I'm an ex-Anglican clergyman. I was born again under the ministry of Reinhard Bonnke. You know Reinhard Bonnke? You don't know? Okay. I'm spirit-filled, but I hate with a passion all those funny evangelical doctrines. I'm a Bible-reading and Bible-enjoying thinker. Mm-hmm. I work as a volunteer, now I'm retired, with ex-prisoners, including particularly sex offenders. Mm. These men, they can't forget their wrongdoing. Society tells them they have no place. Even the church has special hoops for them to get through. Yeah. So without divine forgiveness, how would you help them?
Exactly the way this gentleman talked about how important the I-thou is. How important the relationship of I-thou is. So in conversation with someone who has wounded and been wounded so deeply, I would need to find and lift up and celebrate and reflect back that individual's humanity. I think the creed that can most powerfully be embraced by humanity is, I am human and I see that you are too. And if we can recognize that each other are human I think that we can allow a new relationship to develop. It's too easy to judge someone lesser than you are. That's just too easy. And we make those categories all the time so that we can dismiss the voices of people who are trying to say something important to us. And if someone has been a sexual abuser or done something that we think is absolutely horrible, we don't listen to the story. We simply name the crime and we dismiss the person's humanity. So I think the I thou is the answer to those kinds of situations, and that we're called to them. With or without God, with or without the Bible, with or without Jesus, with or without any system of belief, but simply the conviction that we're all human. And we are none of us free of having fallen short of what we might be. So that's, I think, where I would go.
If I may presume a second question.
You'll have to ask the lady behind you. There you go.
So gracious. This year has been a Toronto year in my life. I've never been there. I met a young man who's an extreme evangelical street preacher. I met the leader of one of the biggest churches in the world, John Arnott and Toronto Airport Church. Have you heard of them? Mm-hmm. What struck me was the underlying agenda of care for humanity is so similar. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've been really enjoyed and encouraged what you've said today, in that these different streams are going in the same direction.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if you got a comment, but I just wanted to say that to you.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think that we, as I said yesterday, I think that we have to find those things that we have in common, right? And lift them up and work together on them, and stop saying that's not a valid way to read the scripture, or that's not an appropriate way to spread the gospel. You know, that's why the book is With or Without God. You know, we can make the world a better place, whether we do it with God as our sustenance or with other people as our sustenance. That's the work that we have to do. And if someone is using their faith to make the world a better place, then I celebrate that. If someone is using their faith to deny someone rights, or to, you know, to create havoc through that denial, then I'm going to get in their face about it, because that's not what I understand faith to be, and I'm going to stand up against that. But I love working together on that. So thank you for your comments.
In our group, just following this, we really ended up with quite a heated discussion, three of us from the same congregation. Where do we go from here? What do we do tomorrow? Tomorrow's Sunday, we're going into worship. Mm-hmm. We're in a fairly modern building, not too different from this, except that we don't have chairs, we have long pews. Nice ones, lovely wood and all that. And for all of us, where we start from, where do we go tomorrow, the buildings on the whole are against us, or against doing the sort of things you're talking about. The format of our worship is not necessarily helpful, maybe in some cases, and we've talked about hymns and so on. I think in some ways in Birmingham we're fortunate in that there are ecumenical things that are going on that help us. This is one of them, I suppose. And then there's a system come January, February, when churches get together and offer overnight accommodation to the homeless, and the church members provide meals at night and that sort of thing. So there are some ways in which it's already started. But my question is, partly to you, partly to everybody else, what are we going to actually do to start this change?
And I acknowledge that. The what to do next is a huge question. I think there are some practical things that can happen, but there's also a dream that needs to find some root somewhere. And in the States, Mike Ouse fed that dream when he planted the Houston Oasis. And that percolated across the country and has been realized in so many different communities now that are caring for hundreds and hundreds of people. So I think that there are some practical things that can be done, and Julie and I were just chatting while you were chatting. How many of your congregations have NA programs or AA programs happening in them? Not many. Oh, that's way less than I thought. Many congregations in Toronto have an AA program that people come to, or an NA. We have an NA program at West Hill, and so there are often other social programs that take place in churches. You rent space to social groups, and they do that. I think that's a good way of getting around those who wouldn't want to be part of making this happen, because I think the next piece of work we need to do is start bringing people together, not us. We have a place that we go, and you may be uncomfortable with some of the hymns and things that happen there, but you have a place to go. But if you just put an ad in the paper and said, you know, I don't know, Sunday afternoon, 3 o'clock, gathering for people who don't believe, or however you want to name it, you can contact the Oasis Network and use their principles and put it out there. Contact the British Humanist Association, say, you're going to put this together. Would they share it on their networks? Phone Tim Nash of the Nomad podcast and say, would you share that we're doing this? And maybe get together and have 6 or 7 congregations do that in their communities. All on the same day, all across the country. You've got all these things that are going to happen, and just see who comes. You know, advertise it, make sure you do the marketing, ask some young person to do the marketing for you.
You mentioned Birmingham, Alabama.
Yes, okay. That Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most, you know, that was the center of racism during the civil rights movement, and is still a very divided group, but it's a very hard place to be a non-believer. And a young woman who was a mom didn't want to go to a church moms group. So she started a Facebook group for secular moms in Birmingham. And the last time I checked, there were 662 young women with children in Birmingham who were secular. And so she's now starting an Oasis community. So those people can come together themselves. There are thousands of people out there. They may not like your pews. They may not like your basement. They may not like the time slot you're able to give them. But you have the knowledge and the leadership and the resources that can coordinate something that lets them come together and then help them figure it out. Don't get in their way. Just say, these are the principles that we're wanting to give you, and let it happen. I think the best thing we can do is get out of our way. And you may find that you go to both those things, but you don't post it in the church bulletin that it's happening. Don't even tell the congregation it's happening, right? Because actually you don't want all those people showing up. Right? It's not another church program. It's for a group of people that don't come together normally. And if you could get the BHA, the British Humanist Association, and you could get the Nomad podcast to put that out, and you could get the Oasis Network, and I could put it out through my network, and we have a bunch of places and times, you can make it happen. I mean, I'm hoping you can make it happen, because it has to happen, right? And that's some of the work that I think, you know, I really want to be part of helping make that happen. And sowing seeds in all of your brains is part of that work, to figure out how you can make it happen.
We have groups here, and some of you belong to them, like Heretics Anonymous and Thinking Aloud. Groups which meet monthly, and we've had these lectures, as I have already said today, for 18 years. But always the issue has been, how do we carry these radical thinking into our worship? And if, as you suggest, a church like Rachel's church, or this one, or any church might decide to have, perhaps even just occasionally, worship offered, which is, well, a service, whether you call it worship or a gathering or whatever, which is different. What would you call it? Because surely the word atheist would be a red rag to a bull.
I wouldn't call it worship, that's for sure. But a gathering is possible. I think that, I mean, I don't have all the answers for this, but the Oasis Network has worked with a number of groups now and has best practices that have figured that out. How do you do that? And it's not the same thing as transitioning a community. It's about creating space for a new community to coalesce. And you may find that some people go to both things. Chances are they'll end up at the same time, though, so you won't have that option for that. Every Oasis community that has developed has chosen to meet on Sunday morning because that's when they're mostly available. So I don't go to the Oasis community in Toronto because I have a Sunday morning gig that I have to go to every week. But they function quite well without my thing. I launched it. I used my media aware attention to let people know about it, right? So that sort of gave it a little boost. But I think the point is not to transition the community. That's a completely different task, and that's working with the worship leaders, with the leadership of the board, and it's allowing for things to shift over time and avoiding some of the issues that we created, right? Get some media attention about, invite an atheist to come and speak here on a Sunday morning and let the media know that that's happening, right? Like that kind of thing. So that getting media attention is extremely important. I mean, I now know that. But it is important for those kinds of things.